And thank you. Okay. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. We may have a few more. My name is Lindsay Scott. For those who do not know me, I'm the Regional Sales Manager for Kendal at Home in the Northern Ohio region. We're excited to have you all joining us for these educational programming. We hope it's helping keep you engaged and informed. We were talking before you all logged on that this really kind of was born out of COVID, but I think there are parts of this that will stick forever because we've been able to share a lot of great, interesting content with a broader group of people. Hope that you're enjoying it. Most of these are virtual. We are going to be trying to add a few in person. Tom will even touch on today really was supposed to be in person up in Massachusetts. But that we had to shift gears here as things are still a little bit uncertain. But I do want to thank the Friends Foundation for Aging for their generous contribution in support of our programming. I am joined in the background. Sue Woykin is on with us today. Sue and I will be keeping an eye on chat and Q&A. So don't worry, Tom, about keeping an eye on any of that. You do your thing and I'll keep an eye on questions. And with that, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome back today Tom Daly, historian and curator. Some of you were probably on during the Norman Rockwell talk and you enjoyed it so much. I'm guessing that's part of why you came back today. But I will let you introduce more about yourself and a little more about your background, Tom, and I will be off in the background if you need any assistance.
Oh, thank you so much, Lindsay. I really appreciate it. And welcome, everyone. It's really a thrill to have the opportunity to do this. We had really planned on doing this in real life. Unfortunately, with the change in what's happening in the country and the world, we opted to do it virtually, which actually created an opportunity for a benefit. And at the end of my presentation, the benefit will be there. For those of you who stick around, I'm going to actually share with you some of my shaker collection. I actually have collected over the years a number of shaker items, and I'll share those with you directly when we get to the end of the presentation. And I'll let you know about that when we get there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just put my initial image up and we'll start our conversation. And do feel free to add in anything that you might want to ask about, any clarification that you may need, feel free to let me know. This presentation was meant to be done in Western Massachusetts. So though the Shakers certainly were out in Ohio and they were in Florida and in Kentucky, this presentation is actually going to focus mostly, on the Shakers that lived in Eastern New York State, in Western Massachusetts, Northern Connecticut, and in Southern New Hampshire, and the community, of course, in Maine. And we'll talk a little bit about them as we continue on. So I'm going to pick the first slide off, but feel free at any point if you have a question, just go through the chat and write a little note in, and we'll get that question answered for you. And whoop. I'm just a moment behind you folks. Sorry about that. Okay, whoops. There we go. So I'm going to show you a series of photographs. All of the photographs that are in this presentation are photographs that I've taken of the Shaker communities that I've visited. During my lifetime, I've been very lucky to visit all but one of the Shaker communities. The one I haven't made it to yet is in Pleasant Hill, Kentucky. And I was fortunate, again, as a younger person to be exposed to the Shakers. I grew up in the Berkshires, just a few minutes from where I am right now, actually. In Western New York State, Eastern New York State, getting my East and West backwards, I'm sorry. And in this area, the Shakers had a pretty strong presence. And as a young person, I had the opportunity, thanks to my grandmother, to start to find out a little bit about who the Shakers were. And I found out about them because of a very iconic object, and that object was a Shaker chair. She happened to have one. She kept it in her basement underneath a bunch of paint cans and some old boxes. And when she was getting a little line years, she said to me, "Is there anything of mine that you would like to have? I don't want to give it to you after I passed away. I want to make sure that you have it while I'm still alive." So she offered me to pick out anything I wanted, and I asked for that chair, and I still have it. It's actually in the room that I'm in right now. And if I had a little bit better setup, I could show you that immediately while I was talking, but I can't do that today. Maybe in the future. And that chair actually created a lot of opportunities for me, but it also kept me grounded and kept me understanding the fact that my grandmother was always there helping me and helping me learn about these very, very important people. So the Shakers are a religious cult that began in the 1730s in England, and we're going to take a closer look at how they impacted the United States, um, if their impacts being felt today, and maybe some unusual things that you might not have realized about the Shakers. And I hope that if you have any facts about the Shakers that you want to share, that you'll share those with me as well. So what we're looking at right here is actually a kind of a neat shot. It's down the driveway at Hancock Shaker Village, which is in Western Massachusetts, right near Pittsfield, Massachusetts, the center part of Berkshire County, which again is in the far western part of Massachusetts. And inside that brick building with the gray end to it, you can just see the gray with the red brick. There's actually a Pierce automobile. If any of you are automobile collectors or interested in antique automobiles, you'll know that that was a very, very high-end automobile. The Shakers didn't spend money frivolously. They spent it on things that they felt were important and things that they thought were going to help them move their cause forward or make their lives a little bit easier. So this is not a picture that I took, of course, but this is how most people imagine the Shakers. They think about them as older people who are sitting around looking grumpy, sitting on uncomfortable chairs, maybe doing a little bit of close handwork. And this perception of the Shakers really started very early on. Believe it or not, when Herman Melville and Nathaniel Hawthorne visited with the Shakers at Mount Lebanon. Melville described the Shakers as being unpleasant people, though he did come to find out that he really enjoyed their company and spent quite a bit of time with them. Uh, Herman Melville also spent quite a bit of time with the Shakers and also appreciated the fact that they were just up the road from them, literally speaking. He was in Lenox at that point, right on the border of Pittsfield, Massachusetts. Melville would later on, unfortunately, reflect on the Shakers that they didn't bathe and they didn't really seem to have a sense of humor. I don't know if that's true or not about either case, but I've met a couple of the Shakers and they seem to be pretty lively people. This might be another view of the Shakers that many would have, which would be them in worship. The Shakers would invite what they would often refer to as the world's people in to watch their worship. And what we're seeing in this image, this was an image that was in a newspaper in the mid 1800s. And what we see is the Shakers are dancing in the middle of the image, and the world's people, if you will, we would be sitting off to the side. And what we're seeing here, the Shakers are actually moving in. They're alternating circles. The men are going left, the women are going right, and that was very traditionally how they worshipped. Music was very important to them. And music, of course, to a group of people who not all of them could read, most of them couldn't even read music. This was a way to unify people because once they heard the sound of the song and the simple words, they would be able to sing along and it would act as a worship tool for them. The Shakers, you might imagine them more like in the Catholic Church, maybe more like brothers and sisters, which is how they referred to one another. The Shakers didn't look at themselves as priests. They didn't look at themselves as anything more than representatives of the community. It's not to say they didn't have folks that ran the communities. They were called elders and eldresses. And we'll talk a little bit more about them as we continue on this morning. So this is what most people, when they think about the Shakers, this is kind of what they think about. They think about that stack of oval boxes that you can see in those different colored boxes. They think maybe about the Ken Burns documentary that was done a number of years ago called The Shakers, Hands to Work and Hearts to God. The picture just above that screenshot of Ken Burns's wonderful documentary is a photograph inside one of Hancock Shaker Village's retiring rooms. This is a brother's room, and this is what most people think the Shakers lived like. The reality is a little different, and we're going to find out about that in just a moment. One of the most iconic images is actually up in the corner, and that's a rocking chair. Many people became familiar with the Shakers as a community started to produce more and more items. One of the things they realized they could make very efficiently was furniture. So mostly chairs, though they did make a few other pieces of furniture. You can see the piece of built-in furniture just below that. That case of cupboards is actually from Hancock Shaker Village. Photographed that 2 or 3 years ago, and it's built into the wall. So you wouldn't have to worry about dusting the top or the bottom of it. The Shakers were very interested in cleanliness. So if you could find a way to put in storage where you wouldn't have to worry about dusting it, the Shakers were, as we would say today, all about that. They also produce clothing, and you can see at the bottom corner, it says Canterbury Shaker, excuse me, Sisters, and they made Dorothy cloaks. And the cloak certainly, like many of the garments that we wear today to protect us from the cold weather or the rain or the wind, you would use those to wear over whatever items that you had on. And you might wonder why the name Dorothy. And that was because that name was the name of the president's wife who wore these cloaks. And unfortunately, right now, I've just forgotten his name, but I will think of it as we continue on. I'm so sorry about that. But Dorothy cloaks became very popular, and what they ended up doing is they would have these exhibitions of these cloaks and would encourage women to buy them. They came in a variety of different colors, from bright, bright red to purple to even sort of more of a gray color if you wanted something a little bit more subtle. So the cloaks were a way for the Shakers to create income for themselves and also to get their word out a little bit. So the Shakers are still around today, and we'll talk about that in just a little while. But the Shakers gave each of us a special opportunity to experience a little bit of their lives. And I'm going to take a break from talking right now and just have you listen to a song you might be familiar with. And that's a song called "Simple Gifts." The Shakers created that song. Some of you might have been exposed to that song with Aaron Copland's work. The version that I just played you there was actually Yo-Yo Ma and Alison Krauss playing together, and it's a song that's been used in many different ways. And the Shakers use songs like this, songs like that one, to encourage their members to worship and to move forward the ideas of Shakerism.
We have a quick question that I wondered if you could address before we move forward.
Of course.
Why did you choose the term cult when describing them rather than a sect or a different word?
Oh yeah, thank you. That's a fantastic question. So the Shakers, when they began in the early 1800s, they were broken off of the Quakers. They were originally called the Quaking Shakers, and there was a lot of reaction to the way they worshiped. They moved violently. Very early on, they actually spoke in tongues. They even used alcohol for a short time. They produced alcohol for the outside world. So they were more a splinter group, if you will. And in the 1870s, when they started their community in Watervliet, New York, they became a little bit more organized and became more of the sect that we might see today. But they originally were more of a cult. They were against a lot of the mainstream things that were happening in the Quaker Church. It's not, the word has a lot of bad connotations, but in this case, it's a splinter group that didn't follow the traditional way of the group that they broke off from. But thank you so much for asking that question. The language of the Shakers is very interesting because people have a lot of different ways to talk about them. And some of them are very complimentary, some of them aren't. And we will definitely get into that as we move forward this morning. Thank you so much for asking that question. I appreciate it. The image that's on the screen right now is actually a spirit drawing, and the Shakers received spirit drawings in the middle part of the 1800s. And what the drawings did, much in the same way the music would do, is they would encourage people to understand the Shaker way of life and where they should focus their attention and where they should focus their religious life. And the Shakers were very interested in making sure that people were treated equally. They didn't believe in marriage. They also didn't believe in procreation. They believed that they would be able to recruit people to come into the Shaker way of life, and that would be how they would continue their church. And so we'll talk about a few of the things that the Shakers believed in. They definitely believed in equality. And when we think about the 1700s to the 1770s, especially, we think about equality for one group of people, usually white males that own property. The Shakers didn't look at the world that way, though. They looked at the world in a very, very different way. They looked at equality for everyone, male, female. They didn't. It didn't matter to race. That had no influence on whether or not you were part of the Shaker community. They wanted true equality. The Shakers also believe very, very closely in the Bible and still recite the Bible during their worship services, even to this day. They follow the Bible very, very closely. One of the places they might not have followed the Bible with, as we interpret it today, is about the second coming of Christ. And they believe the second coming of Christ was in the form of Anne Lee. Anne Lee is considered by many people as one of the founders of the Shakers, though the Shakers did have beginnings before Anne Lee came to the United States. And what Anne Lee was searching for was a way to live a religious life coming out of a very, very difficult marriage. Her husband was abusive and also neglectful. And so what she was searching for was a way to live a life where she could feel that she was also a religious being um, and maybe find some distance from that very difficult relationship. So Anne Lee herself did not believe she was the second coming of Christ, but all of the other Shakers believed that and would kind of try to encourage her to think about it that way, though she definitely maintained throughout her entire life that she was not the second coming or the second appearance of Christ, but she was one of the thought leaders, the person to bring the idea forward. Again, the rest of the Shakers believed very, very certainly that she was the second coming. They believed in cooperation. The Shakers did have jobs assigned to them. Many times the men would be out tilling fields, working with livestock. The women would often be inside working on small hand goods. They might do sewing, cooking. They might be responsible for cleaning the dwelling they lived in. But if there was need and the Shaker sisters had to come outside to do work, they would do that. Same thing with the brethren. If they needed help inside, had to fix something inside, had trouble cleaning something, the Shaker brothers would definitely be called to come in to do that. Back to equality, so the Shaker community had a very interesting structure. Each community was run by a pair of elders. There was a male and a female elder that would run the community. Oftentimes, if the community was big enough, they would have two elders and two eldresses, and then the chain of command would go down from those two folks. And they would make decisions on how the community would live, what the community would do, how the members were were taken care of, making sure the members were taken care of, making sure that they had all the things that that folks needed to live and to survive. They were also involved in making sure that there were businesses around that they could operate to encourage the Shakers to keep making money. Um, they definitely believed in helping others. There's a term that the Shakers coined called winter Shakers. And what they would do would be about this time of year, many people would notice that the Shaker communities um, they would have corn growing or sage growing, and they would come to the community. They would say, well, we want to become Shakers. And they knew the Shakers would put them up. They would get a place to stay. They would get clothes. They would be fed, and they would help the Shakers bring the crop in or repair furniture or help them build furniture. And they were welcome to come in to see if they wanted to join the society. And the winter Shakers, once the weather started to break in the spring, they would often leave the Shaker community. Now, many people would wonder, how would the Shakers feel about this? Well, they were happy to get the help, that's for sure. You can imagine if the crop's out in the field and you need to bring it in, there's not much else you can do but try to bring people in to help you out. When the folks would decide that they were done with their Shaker experience, the Shakers would often give them clothes, might give them a little bit of money, some food, and believe it or not, would actually give them usually a chair or a stool or a piece of furniture to take with them, small piece, so they would have something to start their lives with. So they understood that it was important to help their neighbors, even though the neighbors weren't always that excited about having the Shakers in their community.
Question, a timely question. So was the governance of the community essentially a benevolent autocracy, not a democracy?
It was definitely not a democracy. The Shakers understood that there were people that had, even though they were all equals, there were graders among these equals, and there were folks that were interested in taking this responsibility on. The Shakers, I like to describe the Shakers as a little bit like General Motors. Um, so we had one big company called General Motors. We had one organization called the Shakers, and they were run out of a community in New Lebanon, New York, called Mount Lebanon. And that was the central ministry, the Vatican, if you will, as far as the church would go. And what they did is they made these generalized laws and rules for the Shakers to follow. Each community would follow the laws as it fit in their community, uh, being reminded that it wouldn't be unusual whether or not you were in Ohio or in Florida or in Kentucky, that a couple of those elders from Mount Lebanon might come and visit you and check to see how things are going. So even though uh, they were all Shakers, they all had a slightly different way of worshiping, though, and living their lives, but they were all in very much in unison with the idea behind the Shaker ideals, which was to live a religious life and to also be fair to one another, to cooperate and to help others. So all the communities believed in that, though you'll see as we continue on with the presentation that there are different things that each community did to make themselves separate from the other communities. Again, all under the same auspices, if you will. Sort of like, yeah, General Motors has, had Chevrolet and Cadillac, and at one point had Pontiac, all making cars, but they're all just a little different. So that's kind of how I describe the Shakers in that way. Their leadership um, wasn't absolute, but it was they were firm on the rules that they felt everyone should follow. Also flexible if there needed to be a change or a slight adjustment to what was going on. So so they definitely believed in helping others. They also believed in making money. The Shakers had many, many businesses in each of their communities. And when I say a community, you might have 200 or 300 people living in a community, sometimes even more. The number that people sort of toss around is at their peak, they had about 6,000 people who were living as Shakers. And they would have been from Maine out to Ohio, down to Florida, and throughout Kentucky, as I mentioned earlier. So the Shakers, they were very interested in keeping their livelihood going. They had furniture businesses. They actually had, as I said before, they made clothing for people. And they also invented a kind of neat thing that each one of you have probably had come in contact with at some point in your lives. They invented the seed packet. And that's nothing more than a piece of paper that was folded in just the right way in order to capture seeds for sale. And the Shakers, that was one of their businesses. They sold seeds, and these seeds were looked on as very high quality product that you could always rely on. And the Shakers, again, also, as I mentioned earlier, made furniture, a lot of small furniture, chairs, benches, even footstools for sale. And they were very fortunate that in 17, sorry, 1876, they were at the centennial uh, uh, the Centennial Gathering in Philadelphia, and they were given an opportunity to show their wares there. So they brought chairs and all their other worldly goods, and created an opportunity to really build their brand, as we might say today. They were excited about technology. I mentioned earlier that they had a very fancy automobile. The Shakers also used power equipment. Many times, what they would do is they would harness the water that would be near their communities, and they would use that water to turn water wheels, or even as they did in Hancock, turn a water turbine. And a water turbine, of course, would give you more power with less effort, if you will, and a smaller stream of water. So they were definitely interested in monetizing the abilities they had, and using technology to their benefit. The Shakers did sort of get stuck in time for many people's memory, maybe in the 1800s for most people, early 1900s. But the Shakers that lived in Maine and are still there use the internet. They're on the internet often. You can hear them worship and talk about their ways of life. And it's very exciting to think about the fact that the Shakers were founded before we became a country, and they're still running today and still preaching pretty much the same idea that the Shakers came together with, which is again this idea of equality and fairness and cooperation. They certainly believed in fairness, even though people in the communities weren't always happy when a Shaker farm moved in. And I'll tell you about that in just a moment. They wanted to make sure they were fair to their community.
Who chooses the elders, Tom? And elderesses, am I saying that right?
Yeah, exactly. Fantastic question. So the elders and eldresses in each community were picked by the folks at Mount Lebanon. And the folks at Mount Lebanon were picked because they had sort of worked up the corporate ladder, if you will. And you would work in the ministry in a number of different roles. And the more proficient you got at what you were doing, they would move you up a rung. The Shakers didn't have their own children, of course, so it wasn't something you could pass on to your child. What they would do is they would pass it on to the next person that felt they were worthy of that role. So they weren't elected, they were, you might say, more appointed. And if you appointed somebody from another community, if you happen to be in South Union, Kentucky, the Shakers from the elders and eldresses from Mount Lebanon would go down there and visit the community and make sure that everything was running as it should be. And they would check in regularly, writing letters back and forth. Um, I guess they didn't text very much. They certainly couldn't have, but I guess they probably would have if they had that opportunity. But they definitely kept a close eye on things, being understanding that depending where you lived could change the way you lived your life. So the Shakers, and you can imagine this if you owned a dairy farm. Let's say you happen to live in Hancock, Massachusetts, a tiny town, only a few hundred people, and you owned a dairy farm, and you had a couple hundred heads of cow, and that was fine. You sold milk, you sold cheese, and then you noticed just a little, maybe a little north of you, excuse me, that 30 or 40 people have gotten together and they purchased hundreds and hundreds of acres of land. And they start to have cattle. And now they can have hundreds of heads of cow. And they're making milk and cheese. They're selling beef if they have beef cattle. And all of a sudden, the small local farmer is kind of getting run out of business, if you will. So what the Shakers would try and do is they would try and incorporate their products into what was going on in a local community. The people in the community didn't always respect what they were doing, but often they would realize that if the Shakers were going to offer an opportunity for you to go into business with them or to have your cows graze on their field, they were very willing to do that. So they tried to help, and again, understanding they had their own ways of life they had to maintain. Some of the local farmers weren't that excited about Shakers moving in, if you will. Now, luckily for the Shakers, most of the communities started in the late 1700s into the early 1800s, so they were well established very, very early on. One of the things that when people hear about the Shakers and they think about the fact that the Shakers didn't believe in having children or being married, they wonder how they thought things were going to continue. Um, and that was a challenge for the Shakers. But what they realized was that many people who couldn't afford to take care of the children that they had, maybe they lost a parent, maybe they've come on hard times, many people would often bring their children to the Shaker community. The Shakers had schools right in their community. They would teach you a trade. You learn how to work leather, do woodworking. You might learn weaving. You might learn how to sew. All these things were available to you. And then you had a place that you could live. If you signed the covenant and joined the Shaker community, you would have a place to live. So for many people, it was an opportunity to make sure that their children could continue forward. Um, Most people kind of overlook this last detail that I put on the screen here, which is shared property. And shared property was really the thing that made it difficult for people to join the Shakers. So if you can imagine yourself, it's you and your husband or wife and your two children, and you want to join the Shaker community. You own maybe a small home, maybe you own a farm. So what you're expected to do is when you join the Shaker community, you have to turn over all that personal property. None of that property ends up being yours. No matter how good you are at running it or how wonderful the property is, it becomes property of the community. The marriage at that point would be dissolved. The wife would go live in one part of the community, the husband in another, the children in yet another part of the community. So you would be able to integrate yourself into the Shaker way of life. So the Shakers, the shared property thing was very difficult because we were during the 1800s just moving into a segment in American history where we started to actually own property as individuals, and that was a difficult thing for people to give up. And many people, when they've attempted to become Shakers currently, that's been the biggest complaint that people have had. And we'll talk about that too in just a few moments. So this represents the first community in the United States. There was never a Shaker community outside the United States as far as we can figure. So this is Watervliet, New York. And Watervliet, if you're not familiar with the state of New York, Watervliet is just outside of Albany, New York. It's upstate New York, about 2.5 hours north of New York City. And right in the middle, you see that gravestone that says Ann Lee on it. And that wasn't her original gravestone. Her original stone looked like all the other stones that are behind her. But as people started to do tours of the communities, they wanted people to be able to see where her stone was. So the world's people, if you will, decided, hey, here's a good idea. Let's replace her tombstone and we'll put her name on it so we can know which one is her. So that was a change not made by the Shakers, but made by people who lived in the community who wanted to be able to point out where Ann Lee was. And so that's her stone. What you might notice in the bottom corner is that's one of the few buildings that's still left from the Watervliet community. And they have a sample herb garden and they grow herbs and also flowers. These are things that the Shakers would have grown on their grounds. And that photograph I took actually about 4 years ago. but they're still doing the same thing today, and it's available, it's accessible through the Shaker Heritage Society. A great place to visit, it's a nice place to walk. They have a pond there, and the community was uh, uh, was lived in for a great number of years. When the Shakers finally moved out of Watervliet, they all moved to Mount Lebanon. They that parcel of land was taken over by the city of Albany, and about 50, 60 years ago, they turned it into an airport and a DPW grounds. So though it lost a lot of its Shaker charm, you can still visit and see some of the buildings. The other image on the other side, where you see a lot of buildings there, that's actually a digital image that the folks at Shaker Heritage have put together in order to give you a sense of how big the community was. There were hundreds of people living in that community, all living the lifestyle of the Shakers. The two black and white pictures on the top of the screen are period images of the Shaker community when it was operational.
Did they actually live apart, separated by sex, is a question that came in.
Oh yeah, thank you. That's a fantastic question. They did live separate lives. They were separated by gender. As a matter of fact, I'll show you a couple of images in the very near future, which will show you that they actually entered and exited buildings separated by gender. So men would go in one door, women would go in the other. Though they all lived in the same dwelling house, which might house about 100 people or so. The sisters would live on one side of the dwelling house, and the brothers would live on the other side of the dwelling house. So they lived separate lives. They would see one another on worship on Sundays at the meeting house. They might see one another if there was a cooperative task that had to be done, but they really lived independent lives of one another. And that was true that children were also separated when they could be by gender. And the feeling is that that helped you focus on your work and not be distracted by the others that were around you at the time. So thank you. That's an excellent question, and a question that many Shaker folks kind of glaze over because we're so used to talking about it that way. But I appreciate you asking that question. So this is the first Shaker community in the United States. It's called Watervliet, a name that's derived from the Dutch language. And of course, the Dutch were living throughout the Albany, New York area and down the Hudson River before the English came to the United States to inhabit the Northeast. And they influenced a lot of architecture and a lot of the town names that are in this area. So Watervliet, it's not spelled any way like it sounds. So this is just a little concentration on Anne Lee herself. What you might notice in that top corner, excuse me for getting a drink of water, that little piece of blue fabric is a piece of Mother Anne's dress. And that's actually in the collection of the Shaker Museum and Library, the Shaker Museum in Old Chatham. And they actually have that embroidered on it. It identifies the fact that it's Mother Anne's dress. And you can see on the screen, there's a couple of things that that the Shakers really felt strongly about. Mother Anne predicted, as you can see, that the Shakerisms would dwindle down to the number of members that a child could count on one hand, and then overcome all nations. So she saw the Shakers declining and then rising up again. The Shakers count right now is approximately 2, and I'll talk a little bit about that in just a few moments. And then you can see the other quote next to that with that black background. It says, "Do all your work as though you've had 1,000 years to live, as if you knew you died, you must die tomorrow." Anne Lee understood the importance of making sure people understood how their ways of life would affect the ways looked at the Shakers, and how that could bring you closer to, as she felt, closer to God and closer to a better way of living. So she was considered by most people as the founder and one of the first leaders of the Shakers, definitely in the United States. She came here in the early 1770s, And in 1774, she started this community in Watervliet, New York, just outside of Albany. Her husband kind of hung around for a little while, and then he kind of gets off the radar. We don't really know what happened to her husband. All we have are references to Anne Lee after a point, and she doesn't make any more references to her husband, nor does the Whitakers or anyone else who are very familiar with Anne Lee. So now you're saying, wait a second, Tom, we're in Philadelphia. How did that work out? Well, the Shakers had communities all over the country, as all of you know, and there was a community in Philadelphia, and I included them here because they were actually part of the Mount Lebanon bishopric, which is what they called their sort of next level of organization. So they would have 3 or 4, maybe 5 communities connected to another central community. So the Philadelphia Shakers were an interesting group of folks. Rebecca Jackson founded that community after a visit to Watervliet, and the building that she lived in is the building you can see there on the screen. That was the dwelling house where she lived, and she was inspired by the Shakers living in Watervliet to become a Shaker herself. And the thing that was a little different about Rebecca Jackson, unlike many of the other Shakers living at that time, was that she was African American, and she wanted to live in an urban environment. So she gathered a couple of followers and moved back to Philadelphia. That's where she was from, and founded a Shaker community in basically an apartment building in Philadelphia. And the way they made money was to bring in laundry. They would wash laundry, fold laundry for folks in their community. They lived as Shakers, separated by gender. Her very close friend Rebecca Perot was a big help to make sure that she could organize the community that was there in Philadelphia. And luckily, Rebecca Cox Jackson saved a lot of her writings and a lot of the communications that she had back and forth with the rest of the Shaker communities. They were all pulled together in the early 1980s in this book that you see on the screen right there, Gifts of Power. The image that's in the background is actually an image of Rebecca Jackson's brother. He was a preacher, and Rebecca wanted to be a preacher too, but of course, in the traditional church, she couldn't do that. But because she was a Shaker, she was given that opportunity to preach and did convert a number of people in her community to the Shaker way of life. And this might be a good place to stop for just a second and just remind folks that the Shakers had no plan in place to convert everyone in the world to become Shakers. They still don't have a plan to do that. And I'll talk more about the contemporary Shakers in just a few moments. But the Philadelphia Shakers, what they did was to bring this idea of what more of a rural way of life to an urban environment. It did work for a handful of years. Unfortunately, when Rebecca Jackson passed away, the community was dissolved. They didn't build any structures. They didn't build any furniture. There really wasn't a lot of lasting memorials to them. So all we have is Rebecca Jackson's writings to be able to remember that community. So in the northern part of Connecticut, they actually had a small Shaker community there called Enfield, Connecticut. And Enfield produced chairs. You can see one right in the middle of the screen there. That's what one of their chairs would look like. And you can tell the difference from one community to the next when you look at their chairs, because some people call them finials, the top part of that ladder back chair, each community had their own finial they would use. And that would denote where that chair came from. I don't know if it was a point of pride or just a way to be able to tell the difference, but it's an interesting thing to do considering they were a community that believed that everything should be the same and should be equal. The furniture makers were giving a little bit of this leeway. So what we can look at, if we look at the bottom part of the screen, we see 2 images, an etching of the Shaker community, and then a photograph of the community in Enfield, Connecticut. Now the community thrived for a short number of years. They were part of the Hancock bishopric. So Hancock, you heard me mention a little earlier, They were another section of organization of the Shakers. So Mount Lebanon took care of all of the Shakers and then took care of a couple other communities. Hancock took care of themselves and three other communities, and then they would answer to Mount Lebanon. So you can see that there's a little bit of a corporate structure there. This community, after it was closed, became a prison. It was a large amount of land. A lot of the land was cleared, and unfortunately, a lot of the buildings that you see in that photograph were taken down. There's only a handful of buildings left in Enfield, Connecticut. In order to visit that community, you actually have to get permission from the prison warden in order to be on those grounds to see what's left of the Shaker community. But they did produce chairs and they produced seeds and they produced herbs like many of the other communities in the area. If you're wondering where that is, if you're familiar with the state of Connecticut, it's in the northwestern corner of the state of Connecticut, about 15, maybe 20 minutes away from Hartford. And so here's a little bit more about the Hancock bishopric. And it's a neat word. And if you ever have an opportunity to search the word on the internet, you'll find that word isn't used very often, mostly with the Shakers, but it's used in a couple other places too. And these are a few of the things that the Shakers produced in this bishopric, whether it was Hancock, Enfield, Connecticut, Tyringham, or Savoy, Massachusetts. You can see the seed packets. I mentioned those earlier. Those are what the Shakers, one of the inventions the Shakers came up with in order to be able to sell their seeds. And they would travel throughout the community and they would sell a seed box, which would be about the size of a Coca-Cola flat for a case of Coca-Cola. And they had little pockets and each of the pockets were labeled. And the Shakers would go around and replace whatever seeds were sold out of that display box. Not unusual to what a Frito-Lay person might do today with your potato chips. The map of Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Eastern New York really shows the bishopric that I mentioned before and some of the journeys that Mother Ann made throughout the area. So in Hancock, Massachusetts would be right near where that pink and the yellow line meet on that map of Massachusetts and New York. Enfield would be just into that green section of Connecticut, just south of Massachusetts, the far western part of Massachusetts. And when we talk about New Hampshire, the part of New Hampshire was the southern part of New Hampshire, the Enfield and Canterbury, New Hampshire. And we'll talk about those folks in just a few moments. You might notice a little difference from the photograph I showed you earlier, saying this was a Shaker dwelling room. This is also a Shaker dwelling room, but in the paint the Shakers would have recognized. They tended to paint the interiors of their buildings in bright colors. They liked the use of color, and oftentimes colors would have meanings. If you saw a building painted a certain color, it might have one purpose, another building might have another purpose. And when I show you some of the other photographs, you'll see how those different colors related to the use of that building. Now, Hancock Shaker Village started as a village, excuse me, I should say as a museum in 1961. The Shakers left the village in 1960. And the Shaker Museum that's there now, called Hancock Shaker Village, was a very much a brainchild of Amy Bess Miller. And you can see Amy Bess Williams Miller over there in the corner. She was really the person that championed the idea of turning Hancock Shaker Village, the Shaker Village, into a museum. And right in the middle there, you can see the round barn. Some of you might have seen that. If you ever watched Norm Abrams on TV doing his woodworking, he often visited the museum and did a couple of shoots out there that included that round building. And you might notice the top of the building in this case is painted kind of a yellow, sort of yellow ochre color. And the Shakers would paint the exterior of the buildings that they used for work, for manufacturing, or in this case, barn work. They would often paint those buildings in this yellow color, in this yellow ochre color. And next time you go to visit a Shaker community, you might see that their buildings are painted using the same idea. The interior of the barn is in the top corner there. It is literally a round barn, and that facilitated the opportunity of the Shakers to be able to feed the livestock that were in that barn. In the middle of the barn, there would be hay there, and the livestock would be sent in one of the large open doors, and the cows would gather around that open space and eat the hay that was there. Oftentimes, there would be a Shaker child in the middle that would be pitchforking the hay out, making sure that the animals could get to it. This also created an opportunity to be able to clean out the barn very efficiently, as the barn is actually on 3 levels, as you can see from this photograph. There's a lower level, basically the ground level, and then an upper story. And we'll see that that changed too, to the configuration that we're looking at right now. The lower bottom corner picture, you'll notice, is another brick building. This is the dwelling for the Church family at Hancock Shaker, now Shaker Village. Each community would often have a number of different families, and the families would often be named by the points on the compass. You would have a north family, south family, east family, west family. The There was also a church family, and that church family generally is where the elder and elders lived, and they used the term family to just denote the group of people that lived in that one part of the community. So if you will, you can imagine these Shaker communities really like villages. I mean, there were hundreds of people living there, and there were people who were blacksmiths, there were people who were wheelwrights, there were folks who were woodworkers, people who did sewing, weaving. So there's a lot of activity going on in this very rural community. And here's a couple more shots of the barn. These are a little older. They painted the top part of the barn to reflect the more accurate depiction I showed just a few moments ago. They painted it about 8 years ago in order to reflect that the barn was a working piece of property and not white like they would have painted the meeting house. Now, if you take a look at the top corner, you'll see that meeting house. In this case, it's actually looks like it's white, but it actually was brick. And just off to the side, you can see kind of a conical roof. And that was the original roof to the round stone barn. The Shakers designed it like that, hoping it would keep the snow off the roof and wouldn't leak as much. Unfortunately, what ended up happening was that barn burnt to the ground, and they had to reconstruct the barn. And what they did is they built the image you can see now, the barn that's there now, with this more flattened roof, and that created an opportunity for ventilation, and that ventilation would decrease the likelihood that something might spontaneously combust in that building. In the bottom corner, there's a color photograph of the building with one of its L's, the long barn attached to it. And then there's a HABS photograph of the structure of the barn. And you can see probably from that photograph a little more easily how the barn actually worked. And those HABS photographs were done during the Great Depression. It was a governmental project in order to try and catalog all of our important and historic buildings in the United States. So meeting houses are important things. Meeting house, you can imagine, is a little bit like how we might look at a place of worship, like a church or even a synagogue. And the bottom corner, you can see this very plain looking building with the 2 doors, one for the sisters and one for the brothers. They would enter this meeting house separately, and they would all be called to order at about the same time. The interior of the building would look a little bit like the color photograph just to the other side on the bottom side of this side of the slide. The exterior of all of them looked like that top corner picture, a white cameral roof building. And they all look like that because Moses Johnson designed a meeting house originally, and the rest of the Shaker communities used that design to build all of their meeting houses. Now, that's not to say that some of them didn't change later on in life. They certainly did. The meeting house, the most significant meeting house actually changed at Mount Lebanon from the structure that you see right there to a barrel vaulted building. And I'll show you a photograph of that in just a few moments. I did just want to include that kind of fun photograph that's a historical interpreter doing her version of a Shaker dance inside that meeting house. So again, meeting houses were meant to, each one of them was meant to be exactly the same as Moses Johnson's original design, but they did change. Um, but the interesting thing, as I mentioned just a moment ago, excuse me, was that Hancock opened very early on. And unfortunately for them, their meeting house was in very bad disrepair. So they had to find another meeting house. And the black and white photograph is the meeting house in Shirley, Massachusetts. The one in the color photograph on the other side is also the same building, but that's in its present location at Hancock Shaker Village. So they actually took the building from Shirley, Massachusetts, which is just outside of Boston, and brought the building out here in the 1960s to place it on the foundation of the original meeting house. The meeting house had been lost by that point. And what they found out was that the building fit exactly on that foundation. So they had done a good job in Shirley constructing a meeting house there to the exact specification of Mr. Johnson's work. The bottom photograph is an image of inside that exact meeting house, taken with kind of a wide angle so you get a sense of what the meeting house would look like. It's very simple, um, almost no furniture. You'd have some benches, and the benches primarily were for the world's people, for you and I to be able to go and witness their worship. The benches that are in the middle of the floor would have been moved out of the way so the Shakers could dance in the same way they danced that we saw earlier in that black and white pencil sketch at the very beginning. So we talked about Mount Lebanon. This is the central ministry. This was where all of the rules and regulations came from, if you will. So if you're a community in Kentucky and you wanted to build furniture that was a little bit more elaborate looking than the furniture from Mount Lebanon, these are the folks that would have had to approve that. So what we see in the very center is actually what their meeting house looked like. Their meeting house was very large. Their community was large. After all, when communities would close, and they did close off and on during the run of the Shakers experiences, oftentimes people would come to Mount Lebanon and live there. So the main building, the main image in the main building, I'm sorry, in this photograph is actually their meeting house. And that was built in order to accommodate large gatherings. And the building is still in use today. It's actually being used as a library at the moment for the Darrow School. The top two photographs are of the same building. That's the stone barn. And the stone barn was one of the bigger stone barns in the United States at that time. It existed just the way you see it with that roof on it until the early 1970s. Unfortunately, in the early 1970s, a group of people, they think it was probably young people, were having a get together at night there and had a fire to keep themselves warm. Unfortunately, the fire became out of control and it burnt the rest of the barn. As you can see, the stone part of the barn still exists today, and the Shaker Museum, which is at one of the Shaker museums at Mount Lebanon, is in the process of trying to restore that building to its former glory. The hope will be that it will end up being an education center, a storage center for their museum. At the bottom corner, you can see that very elaborately colored box. That's a seat box. I mentioned that a little bit earlier. This is what the Shakers would give the local corner stores, the general stores. They would be provided with this box, and the Shakers would come through and restock them with the seeds. The vendors would sell them and then pay the Shakers their part of whatever the commission was on the seeds that were sold. And again, the Shakers are very well known for creating furniture. You can see that Mount Lebanon #3 rocker right there. That's the size of the rocker. People became very familiar with Shaker furniture in the 1930s as these communities started to close. What you would find along the road, let's say just like the road that you see in that photograph, there might be hundreds of these chairs and the Shakers would just give them away because people didn't want them anymore. And there were no Shakers living in these communities for the most part, so they didn't have a use for the furniture, didn't want the clutter. So it wouldn't be unusual in the 1930s for people to end up with a Shaker chair. And I believe that's how my grandmother ended up with the chair that she had. The Shakers also created maps of their own communities. This is Canterbury, New Hampshire. Canterbury was the second to the last Shaker community to close. There's still one open community in Maine, and this is what their communities look like. They're kind of at their peak. You can see the different buildings. You can be able to pick out their meeting house right near the middle. You can see barns, and you can see an orchard. Canterbury Shaker Village is open and available to visit. It's worth a trip if you have the opportunity. Also, if you happen to be in New Hampshire, you might want to stop in and see Enfield Shaker Museum. That large building that you see in that bottom corner was the largest stone structure in New England. For a great number of years, it was their dwelling house. And that building is still in operation today. And up until just a couple of years ago, it was actually a bed and breakfast. You could stay there. You could rent a room there and stay there. They aren't doing that as much anymore, but you also can let that building out if you'd like to have a reception or a wedding or something there, or an event, birthday party. You could use that space. So it's a way many Shaker villages have to create a little bit more income for themselves. You'll notice too, there's a Shaker rocking chair here. And if you compare it to the one we just looked at a moment ago, you'll notice, and I'll turn it back, see if we can see that. Whoops. Um, Notice the top part of that rocking chair, that red background, there's a little bit of that wooden part of the chair sticking up. And that is called the Mount Lebanon mushroom, that small ornamentation on the top of the end of that chair. Enfield, as you can see when you look at the top corner of this, the top part of this chair actually had an elongated, almost oval on the top of their chairs. The differences were subtle, but they definitely can be noticed once you start looking at them a little bit more carefully. And here we are at Sabbath Day Lake Shaker Village, and they're in New Gloucester, Maine. They are still in operation. There's still a Shaker community. There's still Shakers living there. Um, and how are they getting along? They're getting along by selling herbs. You can see some of their product down there in the corner. They also sell seeds. So you can see that theme has carried throughout their lifetime. And the village is in that color photograph in the top corner. Now, it doesn't do any good to show you the product if you can't see who's selling the product, and that's these folks right here. I included Sister Frances Carr. She's in that lavender dress, and that's her cookbook that she wrote. She passed away in 2017, so just a few years ago. And I like to show Elders Carr because she was the last Elders that was alive who was a Shaker, and also a big Red Sox fan. So she rooted for the Red Sox, so she wouldn't really watch them on television. She would listen to them on the radio. The other photograph, that other color photograph, is from 2017 as well. Just a couple short weeks before Elders Carr passed away. But who we're looking at here is Brother Arnold had, excuse me, and Sister June Carpenter. And June Carpenter and Brother had joined the Shakers a little later on in life. They have both signed the covenant, they're both actual Shakers. There's a long process to become a Shaker. What you have to do is express your interest in the community. You have to visit them off and on for about a year. You have to live in community with them for some amount of time. And then usually after about 5 years, they decide whether or not you have the spirit inside of you, and then you can become a Shaker. The Shakers aren't out there hoping and pushing people into becoming Shakers. The Shakers want people who actually are Shakers as far as they're concerned. You can see Brother Arnold on the internet very regularly. He'll do versions of their worship service. He'll talk to you about how the Shakers are still worshiping today and some of their thoughts and ideas. And they'll even every once in a while unbox some items that were sent to the Shakers. The Shakers get donations throughout the year, the museum and the community. And oftentimes those donations are given to the museum shop to be sold, or they're kept in the community if there's something that's important to the main community. So the Shakers still exist today, and you can see references to them in many, many different ways in our society.
I just want to make sure, I know you had something fun planned for the end, so I just wanted to give you a little heads up that it is 12:07. So I wanted to make sure that you have time for your show and tell.
Oh, perfect. That was fantastic timing because we are actually at the end. So thank you so much. I'm going to try and see if I can swap back to just, let's see if I can do this. Maybe I can't. Okay. Let's get rid of that. There we go. Okay. So what I am going to do, which I wasn't able to do if I would have come to visit directly, is I'm going to show you a few of the things that I've collected. I've been studying the Shakers since the early 1980s. I got involved with the Shakers, as I mentioned before, thanks to my grandmother having that chair. And soon after I found out about that, I started my college years and made a very good friend of mine who was a professor. And I didn't realize he was interested in the Shakers. He didn't realize I was interested in the Shakers. And he came into where I was working and said, I have to show you this book. I have to show you this book. And the book that he showed me was the Whitney exhibition catalog of Shaker furniture that they had in the early 1980s. And he was excited to show me because he had a couple of pieces in that show. So I don't have anything near what Gus Nelson had, that's for sure. But I'm going to show you a few of the things I've collected, and just to let you know that people are still collecting Shaker items and they still appreciate them. So the first thing is just a little bit of a joke. This is a seed packet, right? We still see those in our hardware stores and when you're shopping, but this is one of the things that made the Shakers famous, if you will, just a regular seed packet. Many folks know them from oval boxes, and here's an oval box that is made out of cherry. They're very simple construction alternatives. You can see the front, the inside. The front of it, they realized that if they put together these boxes using the copper brads, you can see them sort of glistening in the light there. The copper was soft enough that it would bend. So what each one of these brads have done is they've gone through the two pieces of wood, which are woven together there. You can probably see that maybe better from this side. And they hit a piece of metal that they have inside the form, and that bends that little brad over to hold those two pieces of wood together. This one is a cherry box I mentioned before, and it's a reproduction. This isn't one that the Shakers made. This is something that you can get at any Shaker museum anywhere. This is a little bit more traditional form. They didn't necessarily use cherry. They tended to use pine. And you can see that on the bottom. This one's another reproduction. And then the sides would be made out of maple. And a maple is often can be a figured wood, but it's also wood that's pretty easy to work with. So those are three of the reproduction things I have. I also have one of their early tea tins. They also produce tea. And that's a label they actually that's a label they actually printed in Maine. So that's a Shaker artifact right there. I also have a little section of peg rail. I'm going to just try and give you guys a couple of different views of that so you can see what it is. And this would have been up along the wall. The Shakers had these in most of their buildings, and they had many, many different uses. You can imagine an entire wall, maybe 100 of these pegs, and they could hang their cloaks off of them. They could put chairs up on them. Some people did that. They could also hang mirrors later on in the Shaker communities. And they also could put other smalls that they wouldn't want to lose or leave somewhere. So this is actually a piece of peg rail. The Shakers would have cut the wood, would have finished it, and then they would have turned all of these pegs. And the pegs probably would have been made by somebody who might have been a novice in the woodworking factory. I just have two more items to show you, and certainly welcome to take any of your questions if you have any more. This is an oval box that was actually made, and I'm going to see if I have it the right way. I think I do. Yep, this was actually made by the Shakers up in Maine. You can see the label. And this is more traditional with the pine top and the maple bands are on the outside. You can even see those brads kind of sparkling a little bit there. I'll open it for you so you can see what it looks like. Inside, just plain wood, nothing fancy. The great thing about these boxes is that it's so simple but so strong. You can actually stand right on top of one of these boxes and it won't collapse. I'm not going to do that as a show and tell today, but maybe another day when I do it in person. So the Shakers built these items. They didn't invent any of these items. The oval boxes were something that were out there already, and they just kind of added to it. The last item I'm going to share with you is oval box based, but this is a very unusual item. And this is a sewing basket. And I'm going to tip it forward a little bit so you can see inside. The Shakers would make all of these items. There's a pin cushion right here. There's a place to put your needles right there. And there's even a little bit, let's see if it'll come out. There's even a little bit of a wax. I'll hold it up. There's even a little bit of a wax to be able to put your needles in, make sure that your needles are all set. There was an emery strawberry right here, still full of emery. I'm trying to hold it up for you so you can see it. There it is. And the brothers would make the boxes and the handles. The sisters would make everything inside the box. And you could buy these at their fancy goods store, if you will, which would be a way the Shakers, again, could make money and also occasionally interact with the public at large. So I'm more than happy to answer any questions that any of you might have. Sorry I ran a little bit long, but I appreciate your time today. And hopefully at some point, we'll do another one. We can talk a little bit about the Ohio communities and some of the other communities in different parts of the country.
I know you mentioning Florida perked up some ears. I saw a comment somewhere in the chat that said, I didn't know, there were any in Florida. I would love to hear about that story. So we may see you again, Tom.
Oh, well, that would be great. That's a fun story. And they were also in San Francisco.
I'm gonna read more of a comment in the chat. I don't think there's a question in here. It says, we visited the former colony in Kentucky, very enlightening to us. We even got to stay overnight in one of the dwelling houses. The beds were high off the floor and the buildings were aligned along the nearby dirt road that had been replaced by a paved road further away from the Shaker buildings. Beautiful fencing and old trees shading the old abandoned dirt road.
There's so many wonderful experiences in the Shaker communities, and that was Pleasant Hill, I would guess, just from the description. Pleasant Hill in the middle of Kentucky, it's just a beautiful place to visit, and they've done such amazing work there to make sure that everything from the buildings to a riverboat that they have on the Shakers operator they have there as well.
She confirmed that it was Pleasant Hill.
Oh, good. I'm 2 for 2.
You are. You've been you obviously know your stuff. Someone is asking if you still have the chair.
Oh, I do still have the chair. Thank you so much for asking. It was interesting because my grandmother knew nothing about the Shakers. She was a very straightforward person who liked the chair because of the way it looked, even though most people think that the ladder back chairs are not that attractive. And when I started to look at it before she passed away, I was able to explain to her what it was and some of its significance. And she said, well, I'm glad you took that expletive thing off my hands. So that's what she said about it.
But we all view things differently.
Yes, exactly.
Well, Tom, thank you so very, very much. I don't see any other questions coming in, but of course, if someone thinks of something, you can contact us at Kendal at Home and we'll get your question to Tom. I do want to just briefly put up some upcoming programming. Oh, sorry, my slide was ready and now I'm having a hard time getting at it. Okay. Hopefully everybody can see that. Next Friday, 1,000 Years of Music in 1 hour. And
And actually, excuse me, Lindsay, that event is tomorrow.
Oh my goodness, it is. Thank you. I'm glad you said that. I apologize. I'm thinking today's Friday. Truth be told to everyone listening, I have a vacation day tomorrow, so my brain is already on Friday time. Tomorrow we will be having both these events. There's also a Balance and Steps Falls Prevention Strategies that our very own Marla Gordon, our Director of Clinical Services, will be hosting. And of course, keep your eye on our website. Paul, do I hear you? Did you want to add something?
Yes, there's a mistake that I made on that. The second one is on September 21st. My apologies. So it's September 21st at 11 o'clock, not simultaneous to the music. Yeah.
You know, I believe everything's correct on the website. So anyone who
That's correct.
more, just go to the kendalathome.org and follow the courses and seminar link to see what we've got going on over the next week. But Tom, thank you so much. I know that was and thanks everybody for their interesting questions.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.
Everyone have a wonderful day. Tom, I'm sure we'll see you again.
Thank you. Look forward to it.